Dave Williams presents Conversations.buzz.
I don't see how this conversation can be anything except a reunion and, a lot of talk about the past, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. Gary Gerould, the G-Man, 3,000 NBA games under his belt, and Dave GROSBY still waiting his turn to get at the mic.
Great to see you guys.
Yes, indeed.
Gary, look, forgive me for asking. I just know that people who have known and followed your career for so many years, generations, if I might say, at this point, people are wondering. So do you mind sharing your age with us at this point?
I'm 83.
Okay.
Where is the portrait of Dorian Gray in your house? Because you look fantastic, man. You look absolutely fantastic for 83 and living that life. That's unbelievable, Gary.
You're very kind.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, and I am fortunate. And we all know it can change in the blink of an eye, and you just you deal with it as best you can. So
I think attitude has everything in the world to do with it, along with enjoying your life, just having a great time in terms of the people that you're with and the things that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Everything going good. I don't know where to start. Take us back to 1985 when the Kings first arrived in Sacramento. And as I recall, you guys can tell me perhaps who was it, a member of the team that got off the plane and said and looked towards the skyline of Sacramento, which could barely be seen from the airport at that point, and said, "Where's the city?"
I don't remember who said "where's the city." I remember Reggie Theus calling it. Never seen so many farmers in one place at the same time. You remember who said "where's the city," Gary?
Out there, it was really in the hinterlands. There was nothing in that particular area. And when the arena was slapped up in 9 months' time, a temporary bandbox that seated 10,333, Greg Lukenbill, but Reggie would bring his shotgun to practice, and after practice, he'd go out in the fields outside the arena and shoot pheasants.
Maybe a really sheep or two.
The Thomas, north of the Thomas, really was absolutely nothing there at that point. I mean, that place stood out there by itself. There was no restaurants near it. There were no hotels near it. There was nowhere near it. So, I mean, when you flew into the airport, which is nothing there either, and you went there to Natomas, you're like, people live here?
Right. And the amazing thing was that that site was only like 2.5 miles from downtown Sacramento. And yet it seemed like it was a different world altogether.
Yeah, well, like I say, it was a sheep town at the time, around the north of Thomas. A lot of sheep. And I remember that opening day. I remember we broadcast at KFBK. We broadcast the first game, and for a number of seasons. I don't remember exactly how long, but Groz, you and I, as I recall this, when KFBK got the broadcast rights to carry the Kings games, and Gary Gerould was hired. My understanding is through some very heavy lobbying and perhaps arm twisting from KFBK to the Lukenbills. I remember you and I sat there in my apartment living room, and we worked out the broadcast format, how it would go, how it would start, the interview process, and all of that.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I had gotten hired. I'd tried to get the job there I'd been fired from the television station, from Channel 40, and had been out of work for about 6 or 7 months, and was about to go to CNN actually to work on headline news, and then went in one more time to Paul Aaron, I think was the boss then, and said, "Look, I'm ready. I can stay. I'd like to do this." And he said, "Well, we're still not sure." And I said, "It's 3 weeks before the season starts." And I said, "Well, forget it, man. I'm out of here. Screw it." And he just kind of wanted to hear that, I suppose. And he hired me. So I went into work the next day and met Tyler Cox, who was the news director. And he said, "I don't have anything for you to do, so you might as well go." And I said, "Well, I'm going to like this, I think. My first day and I've got it off." And, and I said, "Why don't you let me see the format for the basketball games, and I can see, how I can fit in." And he said, "We don't have a format." So I said, well, I've done college basketball games for a while. I've got an idea of what we can do for a format. And he says, why don't you and Dave Williams figure it out? That's exactly what we did. We put in 3 pregame shows and an hour-long talk show at the end. And then, Gary, now Gary, I'm not sure if we had met before then. I knew who you were, of course, because, Gary was doing, I knew he was the guy who was on NBC and doing auto racing and just started doing football as well and was doing Rayleigh's commercials.
Well, he'd been on Channel 3 forever too.
I wasn't there though. I wasn't there for that. Gary was off Channel 3 by that point,
okay.
but he was doing Indy cars and was doing auto racing. And I remember thinking, geez, well, this guy's not going to want to do the games for this long. He's just going to do them for a couple of years. He's already network bound. And then met him, and geez, what a great guy this is. And Gary didn't know, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here, didn't know a whole lot about basketball at that point, which is astonishing to hear now because he's the best play-by-play man in the game. And he just was kind of learning it as he went along. And, I really learned a lot from him in that aspect about, how you conduct yourself professionally and how you can adapt to things. And, he took right to it like a duck to water. And, we had fun right away. Got along because, it's impossible not to get along with Gary Gerould. And so we got along right away. We had a good time right away. And, the fun thing about that first year was, everything was new, number one, but there were fun things that happened that year. I mean, beating the Boston Celtics, the defending champs at home, was amazing. Was just amazing. and it was an unbelievable first year for everything considering, moving from Kansas City and being in that warehouse, basically, right? Is what it wound up being. It was a warehouse. Was a very intimate place. It was a very difficult place to play. And I remember being just excited when NBA players would come into town and thinking, geez, these guys, this really is a major league town now.
Yeah. Gary, how did you come to it?
Well, it's kind of a convoluted story, and I try to condense it. But to me, it was intriguing. It was, I think, January of 1985. I get a phone call out of the blue from my old friend Dutch Van Dusen, who unfortunately passed away within this last year, just about a year ago right now. But he was working with the Kings in Kansas City. There was Sacramento ownership. There was a lot of speculation about whether or not with the Sacramento ownership were they trying to move the franchise to the West Coast. Well, I get this cold call from Dutch Van Dusen, who says, I want to play What If with you. And I'm kind of intrigued. I said, oh, well, okay. He said, what if the Kansas City Kings were to move to Sacramento? Would you be interested in being the radio play-by-play guy? And I'm like, I take a beat and well, what? Of course I would. Now, there'd have to be some minor changes and arrangements to work around possible conflicts that I have because of my responsibilities as a freelancer with NBC. And he said that wouldn't be a problem. Well, a few weeks go by and I get a call from Paul Aaron, who Dave Groz mentioned just a moment ago. He was the general manager of KFBK. And he said, Gary, day after tomorrow, I'm flying to Kansas City to see the Kings, to meet a couple of people in the organization. Would you be interested in going? And I said, well, of course. And so we flew to Kansas City. We met Joe Axelson, the general manager. We met Bob Whitsitt, his assistant general manager, Julie Fye, who was the head of the media relations department, and Kevin Harlan, who was in that season was doing Kings basketball in Kansas City on radio. And so it was terrific. And we fly back home and I'm thinking, well, something must be happening, but nobody's saying anything definitive. And then a couple more weeks go by and I get a phone call and it's from Kansas City saying, Gary, the Kings are going to be out to play the Lakers in LA and the Warriors in Oakland. We would like you to go and record the game so that, be kind of like an audition so that we can hear your style. So I take my then teenage son, Bob, out of school and we go to LA and we go to San Francisco or to Oakland for those 2 games. And I set up in the nosebleeds at the Great Western Forum in LA, a couple of rows behind the legendary Chick Hearn. And, you're a mile and a half away from the floor looking down there. And my son's trying to keep some, basic stats and things like that. So we do the game and then and it was interesting because at that time, the Kings were staying at the Airport Marriott Hotel. Wow. And it was the Marriott's courtesy bus shuttles that took the Kings to the arena. So Bobby and I go and get on the shuttle bus and you know, the likes of Reggie Theus and Eddie Johnson and Larry Drew and LaSalle Thompson looking around like, who the hell are these guys? What are they doing on our bus? And Bill Jones, who was the athletic trainer at the time, said, this is Gary and this is his son, Bob, and they're okay. Take care of them. And those guys were welcoming, open arms, and it was just that simple. So we do the 2 games. I later find out that that's what Joe Axelson listened to when he was driving from Kansas City to Sacramento when the relocation had been completed. And that was, I guess, the final hurdle or test. And I had to have his blessing. And I remember at the time, I didn't tell him it had been 15 years since I'd last done any play-by-play basketball. Axelson later put his arm around me. He said, kid, you were a hell of a lot better than you had any right to be. I said to myself, I said, if you only knew. And Groz, you're so right. I mean, I didn't know the NBA game. I didn't know the ins and outs and the people. I listened to the legendary Bill King, Warriors basketball in Northern California. I knew a little bit about that. I loved his irascibility, and I loved how he just would full on make these blatant attacks of the officials and their ineptitude in one thing or another. And he had a way of shaping words and creating a picture. And I just thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. And now I've got a chance to be part of this company. And I also later found out that I guess they had to open the job publicly, even though, you know, they wanted a local identity. That's how I entered the picture in the first place. And Dutch Van Dusen was the conduit. But there were a lot of broadcasters, I later found out, already working in the NBA who wanted to relocate to California with the knowledge that the franchise was going to shift from Kansas City to Sacramento. So in a long, convoluted way, that's kind of how the whole thing evolved and came about. And then I met Groz, and we ended up that first year doing things together, and we seemed to hit it off. And even though, you know, I'm just kind of stumbling my way along thinking, well, this is a wonderful opportunity, and I'm so excited for Sacramento. And this now legitimately, you have a professional sports franchise that's the real deal. And people were excited. And so many times I've heard over the years how I learned the game from you on radio.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, is a great testimony to the fact that we all learned together. But there was this passion, and the sellout streak from day one went to almost 500. I think it was 497 consecutive sellouts. Wow. For the Kings in the first 10 years in California.
We got them all to come down in tuxedos and evening gowns on opening night.
Opening night it was, yeah, it was tuxedos. You remember that, Groz?
Yeah, vaguely.
There's still a picture in the media center now at Golden One Center, which is the home of the Kings in downtown Sacramento. And there's a giant blow up in the media room of me at center court in a tuxedo interviewing Reggie Theus, and it had to have been from opening night. And that's just a cool reminder every night I walk in there that you know, about what happened 39 years ago. That's just amazing to me that it's been that long.
39 years without getting a sniff of the championship.
Well, that's not true. That's not true. One year. And Gary, by the way, learned very well from Bill King, because he would take some shots at those referees too when he didn't like what they were doing. And then yeah. I maintain that, was it 2000, Gary, the 7-game series with the Lakers, where Tim Donaghy, who we know went to jail for throwing games, you know, called 30 fouls on the Kings and 5 on the Lakers, and the Lakers won the game. I thought that Kings team right there, I don't know how you felt, Gary. I thought that Kings team right there was good enough to win the championship, and probably would have if they had gotten a fair shake in that game.
Yeah, that was 2002. It ended up being a 7-game series with the Lakers. The Lakers won Game 7 in Sacramento in overtime. And it was a game where I think the Lakers shot, I think it was 24 free throws in the fourth quarter. 24 free throws, which many nights is an entire game. And they did it in one 12-minute segment. And yes, the Kings, I really believe that year it was the then New Jersey Nets who represented the Eastern Conference. And they got swept by the Lakers, and I think the Kings would have swept them as well. So they were that close, but that close doesn't put a ring on your finger, that's for sure.
I want to throw something out to both of you guys. I think it's kind of the obvious question. It's something that is always being talked about in terms of the NBA in sports circles, and that is how the game has changed over fairly recent years, and how we see so many 3-point shots and nobody goes to the rim anymore. What is your take on that, Gary?
Well, no question. I mean, it's been a monstrous change. The physicality that we used to see. I mean, it used to be that, you could have knockdown slugfests, literally, without penalty or without any repercussion. And now you breathe on a guy and they'll review it to see if it was up around the head or the neck for a possible flagrant foul. It's a totally different game. I think David Stern, when he was the commissioner, the late David Stern, then succeeded by Adam
Silver.
Adam Silver, thank you. They wanted to make this a more fan-friendly game in terms of offense. And so they changed some of the regulations that related to how you could hand check and one thing or another defensively. And that has just opened the door for, on the offensive end of the game. And then with analytics, and you can debate analytics until you're blue in the face. And I'm not a big analytics person, but you're right. You see guys on a transition break, and we saw it last night in the Sacramento Kings win over the San Antonio Spurs. Transition break. The Kings don't run to the rim in the break if they have numbers. If it's a 3-on-1, 3-on-2, they run to spray out the ball out to the corners to shoot a 3.
Right.
Well, it's wonderful if you make the 3, but if you don't make the 3, then you've given up a certain 2. And so you're kind of torn between that. And it's a philosophical type thing, and it varies from organization to organization. But what we're seeing, in my mind, in recent years, and last night was a perfect example. Victor Wembanyama, who is a just turned 20-year-old rookie from France who plays for San Antonio, is a generational player. He's 7'3", and his ball handling skills are just, I mean, you take a breath and you say, how can he do that? How can any person who is 7'3" handle the ball the way he does? But it's not just Victor Wembanyama. It's every ball player now. And the ball handling skills have become so much better. The athleticism is so much better. If they want to attack the rim, they play above the rim. It's just a different game. And the purists, I think some purists may, say, nah, it's really not for me. But I think for the most part, as far as the NBA product is concerned, it's entertaining. And the pace gets faster and faster every year. The Kings set a record last year for offensive rating and pace and averaged right around 121 points a game. Well, this year, those numbers would barely be in the top 10. That's how much the game continues to advance on a yearly basis.
I remember I'm sorry, go ahead, David. Go ahead.
I'm not a purist, but I like the game the way it was, to tell you the truth. I thought the last really good team that played the style that I liked was in Sacramento, was that 2002 team with Chris Webber and Jason Kidd and White Chocolate. And they just passed the ball and kind of took a page from the Bird Magic teams when we first started. The Celtics and the Lakers were good, and those teams that thought about pass first. I mean, it was just a much more entertaining brand of basketball than James Harden dribbling for 23 seconds and then shooting a 3-pointer, which is generalizing, I'm sure. And I like defense a little bit more. So I'm not enamored with the game today. Although I agree with Gary, the athleticism is off the charts. But no one plays defense anymore, and it's just I wonder what guys like Jordan would do in a game where he couldn't be hand checked. I mean, the Jordan rules Detroit was about knocking people down all the time. I think there's a handful of guys, Gary, that could probably play in that old era. LeBron James certainly would head that list, but it's different strokes for different folks. It's a different game now. It's really promoted by individual players. And teams come to town. It's not so much that so-and-so is coming to town. It's the Bucks are coming to town. It's Giannis is coming to town. Right. The Stars, it's star-driven league, and they've done a good job with that. And you're right, the scoring is way up, and it's an entertaining brand of basketball for the most part. But I kind of miss the way the game was played beforehand. So I guess that does make me an old stick in the mud.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, obviously the contention continues about the old days when you would see, you know, what would Mitch Richmond be doing in the NBA today? You know, if he wasn't driving to the basket and fighting his way to the rim, and people like him in those eras. That was exciting. That was the way I learned the NBA, because when the
Yeah.
Kings started out, that's the way the game was. And my wife and I would sit there and just, you know, just go crazy over the battling that was going on below the rim, and then somebody would kick the ball out. You mentioned Jason Williams, White Chocolate. Oh my gosh, I remember when he got so red hot and became so famous overnight on national media that you had people like Magic Johnson coming up just to watch him, and other people from LA who came up. You know, there were stars showing up at Kings Arena to watch Jason Williams. There's just a lot of great memories for that team over the years.
Yeah, it really was a terrific time, and it hasn't been duplicated. You know, it was 17 years that the Kings last were in the playoffs. They finally made it last season. I mean, you talk about wandering in the desert looking for an oasis. I mean, it's amazing that we survived. I jokingly tell people, you know, before that, I used to be 6'4", and they beat me down to 5'8". You know, losing wears on you. There's no question about it.
Well, I know what you mean, Gary. We had the same thing up here with the Seattle Mariners, who went 19 years without making the postseason, and it does wear on you a a little bit. You wonder how it can happen. How can it be that way? Cowboys for
Yeah, I'm wearing a
25 years since they
Cowboys
won a
shirt.
championship.
So,
You know, it's just something about not being there, and I was surprised. I mean, you know, I know the fan base went down a little bit, G, but did the hardcore stay with the team during that wilderness period?
It's amazing. I mean, they have, and it's just they were so starved for success last year. Mike Brown comes in with a new coaching staff and kind of a new philosophy relating to a lot of different things, and he checked so many boxes in such a short period of time that it revitalized not only the fan base, it revitalized old broadcasters like myself, and it's just so refreshing to feel a little more like on most any night no matter the situation or what team you're facing or what arena you're in, that you've got a chance to be competitive. And we haven't felt that way in a couple of decades. And so it's just, as like I say, so refreshing and so reinvigorating. And that helps you in terms of not only your interest, but I think it helps you in terms of your performance and your broadcast. You know, we all strive to be, as broadcasters, to do our best every time you get the opportunity. But over a period of time, if you're constantly losing, you have to really talk to yourself some nights and try to find something, some ray of positivity that you can feed off of. But the same token, I've always believed that you've got to be a realist and you can't deceive your audience. And if the Kings are stinking the joint up, I'm going to tell you that the Kings are stinking the joint up. And I think that's the fair and the right way to approach it. Of course, I want them to win. You travel with a team, you know them, you run into them in the hotels, you're on the same flights, you're on the same buses, one thing or another. They become family. You're part of a family. And that's one thing that Mike Brown really stresses. When he first came in a year and a half ago to Sacramento, he made his first news conference, and he said a couple of things that really resonated with me. And he said, I look at this organization. He was coming from the Golden State Warriors and the great success that they'd had in recent years, winning 4 championships, I think, in 7 seasons. And he's working under Steve Kerr, and they're doing amazing things. But he said, I look at this Kings organization and I don't see a soul. You have to have a soul. And he says, I'm not talking about the players and the coaches, the training staff, the front office. I'm talking about everybody. I'm talking about everybody in the organization, from the ticket takers to the people who guide you to your seat. You all have to be pulling on the same rope. You have to have the same belief, the same faith. And I thought, you know, he's absolutely right. Yeah. And then he talked about defensive challenges. And, you know, in today's game, he's old school in the fact that, and he brings it up almost on a daily basis. If you're going to succeed, it's not just getting to the playoffs, it's going deep in the playoffs. And if you're going to be able to do that, you've got to play defense. Well, on that first public gathering, media, there were a handful of Kings players, including De'Aaron Fox, who's become somewhat, along with Domantas Sabonis, the face now of the franchise. Foxy's leaning up against the wall on the other side of the room. And Mike Brown says, I remember De'Aaron Fox from his high school days in Texas and at a clinic or a camp or one thing or another. And I remember how I thought, man, his quickness, his speed is astounding, but he's got the skills to be a good defender. And if we're going to have success, we need people like De'Aaron Fox to step it up defensively. So he's basically calling out one of the stars of the players the first time he's in Sacramento, offering the challenge that you've got to be better defensively to help this team. And it's kind of blossomed out of all of that. And it's encouraging, it's enheartening to see that the franchise has responded, the fan base has responded, and there's new hope in Sacramento. Now, that being said, as tough as it is in the Western Conference this year, you're in a dogfight every night. And there are no guarantees that the Kings are going to be back in the playoffs. They should be, but their inconsistency has hurt them this year. They've lost games that they absolutely should have won. And over the stretch of an 82-game season, Groz, you know this, there are going to be nights when you win some that you don't expect to win, and there are going to be nights that you lose some you never expected to lose. And it kind of balances out. But if you're going to have success, and if you want to avoid a play-in, you've got to be in the top 6 in your conference. And right now, that's a pretty tall task with 27 games remaining in this season for Sacramento. So it's an interesting ride. It's fun, and it lights my fire. I mean, your passion for the game and what you do is enhanced when the team you're working with has some semblance of success.
Lighting your fire. That's not hard to do, I can see. Oh, you mentioned Mike Brown saying that the team needs to have a soul. And the first thing I thought was, look at Gary Gerould, 83 years old, called more than 3,000 NBA games, and you're still fired up about it on a daily basis. I don't know how you do that. Groz and I are both retired. And I've just gotten to a point where, okay, I've had a terrific career, and I don't miss it at all. But
good for you.
Well, you seem like you really would miss it. How much longer are you going to go, G-Man?
Well, my wife and I have always had, kind of the joint feeling that as long as I enjoy it, as long as I'm blessed to have good health, and as long as I feel like I'm wanted in that position. And that sounds a little self-serving, but that's true. But those are kind of the parameters for our family. And I'm blessed to be among a relatively small group who have the opportunity. And I never thought back in those first years with Groz alongside that, it would ever end up being any kind of a run like this. But hopefully, if the creek don't rise, we can just hang in and keep doing it and maybe enjoy some more success along the way.
Well, I appreciate what Gary said about doing the games, because I started doing Seattle U games, and unfortunately I got Parkinson's and a few other health things, so I had to give that up. But that's something that I would still be doing that if I was healthy, because there is something about being with an organization, with a team, in this case a college team, where you're close to the people that are there. You care about the players who are there. You care about the people around the organization. In this case, around Seattle University, you care about how they're doing, and it doesn't feel like work. It just doesn't feel like work at all, and it feels like you've got another family and you've got obligations to them. So, I would have kept doing that, as opposed to the day-to-day stuff, which I was happy to get out of. But there is something very special about game. Gary's not the only one who's in his 80s who's worked play-by-play. There have been plenty of guys in the NBA. Al McCoy down in Phoenix, I know, did it for a long, long time, and Chick Hearn, of course, did it for a long, long time, and there are many guys who do that for that very reason. I think it by itself keeps you young, because you're around young people all the time. You're relating with them all the time. They're relating with you all the time, and it just becomes like an extended family to you.
I don't know if we properly explained at the beginning, but I did make a reference to Groz waiting to get his shot at the mic, and that was a joke, because you did back up Gary. You were his go-to guy if he had to take a day or two off to go do a race someplace or something of that nature. Huh?
Gary did NFL for a couple of years. Terry O'Neill had him doing NFL football. So I wound up doing, I think that first year, Gary, I did like half the games, the first 20, because you had motorsports going, you had the NFL going. I know you did the Olympics in Korea, right?
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was during that
So,
time as well. So Gary was multitasking seriously at that point.
Groz, you
yeah,
always I'm sorry, inevitably with this kind of link up on Zoom, we end up talking over each other. Don't
No
lose
worries.
that thought. Don't lose that thought, Gary. Groz, I was just going to ask you've over the years, you've had so many great anecdotes about those old days around the Kings. I know that you got to be good friends with Joe Klein and some of the other guys, and you've told some great stories. I was just wondering if you could share one.
About the players?
Yeah.
I think I'll give you a Joe Klein rookie story, which is kind of funny. Joe was the Kings' first rookie draft pick, so a lot of excitement about him. From Slater, Missouri, 6th-round pick, went to Arkansas, and was really a quiet, soft-spoken country guy. And to emphasize that point, everyone in town was excited, like Gary said, when the Kings came to town, just to be involved with it anyway. And so I had a friend, Chris O'Brien, who unfortunately passed away, who was working at Braley and Graham Buick, and they wanted to give Joe a car. They wanted, to have Joe do the car, maybe do some commercials for them, or just have the car and ride around with it. And so he wasn't sure what to do, and so I went with him and introduced him to Chris, who they wound up becoming very, very good friends. And so Chris says, "All right, well, let's see, what do you want?" And he looked around and he pointed at, "Well, that looks all right." And it was like an 8-year-old used truck. He's like, "No, you get a new car. Pick a new car, pick a big car." And he's like, "Well, how about that Buick Skylark or something like that?" He's like, "That's a tiny little car. Take a big car. You're 6'11". And so he was just so worried about that it was really funny. And
Didn't
as
Klein
much story
say
I think
something
with a
about,
player. Yeah.
didn't he say something to the effect that, well, this one gets better mileage? And he just
Yeah,
been
something
given a
like that. I
huge...
mean, it was crazy. This is good enough for me. He's like, "Well, look, for the dealership, we want you to have a good car." So, geez, it was a lot of funny things going on with those guys the first couple of years. And then, we had interesting coaches come in too. I mean, Bill Russell, when he came in, which was, I think, just for everyone, was just an overwhelming thing. And he brought in Willis Reed, who I think Gary would agree with me was just an unbelievably great guy. I mean, was just a real terrific guy. And I grew up in New York, and I remembered, 69. I was only 9 years old, but I remember him walking onto the court, and it was my chance to actually, he was in the we're in the Red Lion, I think. It was before one of the games or after one of the games, and I said, "I'm going to buy Willis Reed a drink. I mean, this is going to be special for me, because I'm going to walk up there and I'm going to buy him a drink." And so I introduced myself to him. He said, "I know who you are, Dave." And I said, "I'm sure this happens to you all the time, but I remember being motivated by your walking on the court in '69, and you were such a great player, and I'd really like to buy you a drink." He's like, "Oh, you don't have to do that." He's like, "No, I really like to. I'd really like to." He's like, you really don't have to do that." And I said, "Why? Why can't I do it?" He says, "Well, I have a pretty big drink normally." I'm like, "Well, that's okay. I mean, that's okay." And he got like a triple Cavassier with a sidecar. It was like four shots of alcohol, and I was expecting a drink. And I understood why he said it. And he said, "See, you don't have to do it." And I'm like, "No, I'll do it. I'll do it. And this was like a $30 drink and 30 years ago or something like that. But it was just such a nice guy. He was such a nice guy, and that was sort of the fun of the team being around then too. Was getting a chance to see royalty. I mean, Jerry Reynolds was Jerry. We all know Jerry was from French Lick, of course, so he knew Larry Bird, and he would tell stories about Bird and whatnot, and it was funny because he would be one of the only guys that you ever see Bird talking to would be Jerry, because he knew his big brother so well. So it was just the fun. And then I think all the players, if I remember right, hung out. There was really nowhere to hang out in Sacramento, and they built a place near the Red Lion. It was a pool place. Do you remember it? Confetti.
Yeah.
And that's where you go in there, and for every road game, you'd have players in there from other teams, and Theus and other guys would come down there and play pool, because it was a big pool hall. And that year, I think the first summer of Sacramento, I want to say, you had Akeem Olajuwon in town a lot, because he was marrying a girl from Sacramento. You had Dennis Rodman in town a lot for the same reason. And, you know, these guys were just hanging around, you know, during the summer in Sacramento, and geez, this is really going to be a big deal here. This is really going to be a big thing here.
I remember you taking up tables at the Pepper Mill after games with players and coaches there.
Yeah, it was just everyone, you know, it was just a really good time. It was a really good time, and that first crew of players, you know, they could have been a lot more standoffish than they were, and they weren't, because you had guys like Eddie Johnson and you know, LaSalle Thompson is another great example of just a great guy on that team. You know, you had just a good group of people there, and you know, it was really that was an important part of, I think, the success there was that the Kings came in, you know, with a lot of publicity, and they were really good guys, and Luganville was amazing. And I still remember looking up and seeing him fix the ceiling that night when they were getting leaks in there, and I'm like, there's no other team like this in sports. It's got an owner who's up there, you know, handling stuff like that himself.
I don't want to. I'm sorry. No. Go continue. Finish.
Well, I was gonna jump to another thing, because I was thinking about, you know, the Kings almost came to Seattle. This was this is about 10 years ago, Gary.
Just over 10 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, there's a guy here who had been a ball boy in the old Sonic days, and he hooked up with Steve Ballmer, who's the current owner, of course, of the Clippers, but lived up here because he ran Microsoft. And they were going to go after a team, and the Kings were trying to get an arena downtown, and didn't have it yet. And you know, they were really, people here were really confident it was going to happen. And I had heard a story that Kevin Johnson had gone to, it was the mayor at that point, had gone to David Stern and said, "What do we have to do to keep the team?" And David Stern said, "You get a publicly built arena, you'll keep the team." And they did that, and they did keep it, even though the Sonics group wound up offering $60-70 million more. They kept their word to the Kings. And I was wondering, Gary, how, in Sacramento, how much were people concerned about the team leaving at that point? Was it something they were really worried about there?
Oh, the angst and the agony. I mean, absolutely. And as a broadcaster, I mean, there was a stretch. The story surfaced. There had been a lot of speculation about possibility of the franchise moving. The Maloofs owned the team at that time, and there was talk about moving to Virginia Beach. There was talk about moving to Las Vegas. There was talk about moving to San Jose, being in the market with the Warriors. There was talk about going to Anaheim. And then this business of Seattle came into the picture, and it looked like it was an absolute done deal. And there were people saying that, you know, it's first and goal on the half-yard line. It's that close to being reality. And when we all learned of that, not only as broadcasters, but the fan base, it was agonizing. And we got, you know, every night before a ball game, I literally had to talk to myself to, you know, give myself a little rah-rah pep talk about, don't let this drag down your performance. Don't let this seep into the broadcast. If in fact these are the final games we know of the Sacramento Kings in Sacramento, try to make them uplifting, upbeat as best you can. And that was a huge challenge. And I absolutely believed it was a done deal. And I was taking more pictures than normal in arenas and colleagues and one thing or another, because I thought I want to have these memories when this all goes away. And it was so sad, because it wasn't just, you think about the lives that would be impacted, and the ticket takers, the ushers, the people who worked parking cars, one thing or another. You think about, at that time, I think the Kings were about 28 or 29 years into their being in Sacramento. And there was a whole generation that had grown up with the Kings as basically the only game in town. And now you were going to take that away. And you think about the young kids who would be denied the opportunity to go with their mom or dad or uncle or grandpa or whatever to a Kings game, to be in an arena, to see firsthand, you know, the Michael Jordans, the Kobe Bryants, one thing or another. And it hurt your heart. I mean, Dave, I thought it was an absolute done deal. And somehow, and you're right. I mean, Kevin Johnson sat down with David Stern, and as I understand it, Stern wrote out a list of approximately 40 to 45 items, a checklist. If you can check these boxes, I can assure you the Kings will not leave Sacramento. And the foremost one was the fact that, you know, you've got to have a new arena, and it needs to be downtown. And fortunately, Vivek Ranadive and a group of his colleagues came to the rescue, and they were able to put up an offer, and it wasn't as good as what was being offered by Seattle. And here's another little offshoot. You think about, this is 10, 11 years ago. The selling price ended up being right around $525 million, which at that time was a record in the NBA for the value of a franchise. And this is in an intermediate market, Sacramento, California, over $500 million for this basketball team. 10 years later, there are now multiple teams that are valued in excess of $3 and $4 billion. Isn't that amazing?
It's astonishing. It's astonishing.
But somehow, the story had a happy ending. We got to the end of the regular season. You talk about emotion. People didn't want to leave the arena. Grant Napier and Jerry Reynolds, who were doing the television side, I was doing the radio side. They were literally emotionally choked up in tears in the final broadcast. I was doing everything under my power to try not to be swept up in that emotion, but knowing full well this was the end of the road. And people would say, well, if they do move, you'll go with them. Well, no, that's not the way it works.
Right.
If they went to Seattle, they want somebody from Seattle.
Calabro,
yeah, and identity. And at any rate, when the news came that there was a meeting, it took place in Dallas, Dave, and the owners, the representatives of the league, one thing or another, it came to the deciding vote. And Kevin Johnson, to his everlasting credit, had checked off the boxes, and David Stern somehow found a way, and it happened. And the announcement was made that the league would not approve a move to Seattle. The Kings were staying in Sacramento. And you talk about rejoicing. And I remember at the time I'm in Southern California with my wife. We're at a timeshare. We're out that particular day. We happened to be in La Jolla, and we stopped at a service station. My wife needed to go to the restroom, and I hear this news on the radio, and she comes back, and I'm almost gone totally out of my mind with the fact you can't believe what's happened. And the Kings are staying in Sacramento. It was crazy. It was just crazy.
Well, I think a lot of people from a lot of walks of life can tell you, and have told you, and will tell you for as long as we've been alive. It's like, there's something about Sacramento that people grow there and stay. Yeah. And when I first got to Dallas, it's been 13 years now. From time to time, my path will cross with Mark Cuban. He typically would come in and do our morning show and try to sell some tickets and whatnot, talk about politics or whatever. And at one point early on, he said to me, so are you a Mavs fan now? I said, Mark, when the Sacramento Kings first hit town, I was at center court introducing the first team to the crowd. No, I'm not a Mavs fan. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's great.
This is great. Thank you both so much. This has been fantastic. I know everybody's going to love it in Sacramento and everywhere else for that matter. I really appreciate it. Both of you. Love you both.
Well, thanks, Dave.
And very kind.
Gary, again, I tell you one last thing about Gary. I'm watching, Netflix has got a documentary on Reggie Jackson called Reggie. And I'm watching it, and about 40 minutes into it, I hear this familiar voice asking Reggie Jackson a question, and it's you. Yeah. It's like in the early 70s. And, the smooth as silk, it was just great. It was like running into a friend that you haven't seen in a long time. I stopped the tape. Bonnie, come down here. Look, Gary Gerould.
Yeah, I saw that. I noticed that too.
I think I sent you a note on Twitter about it. It was great seeing you then, Gary, and it was great seeing you.
Yeah, thank you. I came as a total surprise, and there were a lot of folks who happened to see that and let me know about it. And when I finally saw it, I thought, okay, yeah, I remember that. Harry Sweet was the photographer. We went to Reggie's apartment in Scottsdale for spring training, and we were doing a feature, and for whatever reason, Reggie and I hit it off, and he welcomed me in, and I remember getting to ride with him in his Porsche Carrera, and I was just thinking, wow, this is about as cool as it gets right now. But good times. Thank you, guys, for remembering that.
Gary, David, thank you so much.
Blessings to you guys. Good health. Hang in there, Groz. We think
my best to Marlene.
I will. best to Bonnie, and I just, keep doing your thing, man. And
Will do,
hopefully
man.
a day at a time, and hopefully somehow it gets better as you go.
Appreciate it, Gary. Thanks, Dave, for having me do this. This is terrific.